It's not exactly surprising to hear that New York is expensive, but recently, the cost of living in the city has been increasingly getting out of hand. In 2023, the average rent in Manhattan hit a record of almost $5,600 per month. Average rents have been growing at over 10% a year, and life in the city is becoming increasingly unaffordable for more and more people. But while you might think that it's always been like that, or that it's a natural consequence of a growing population, none of that is true. New York didn't actually used to be nearly as expensive and unaffordable for so many people until relatively recently. And its population has been actually falling for several years, but rent prices keep going up anyway, even though it seemingly doesn't make any sense. But there is a reason, although a different one than you might think, for why that's happening, and why it's only gonna get a lot worse. So what's going on with New York? Why is it becoming unaffordable for an increasing number of people, even as its population is going down? And how bad is it going to get? This is why no one can afford to live in New York anymore. But first, I want to tell you about a partner of today's video, Delete Me. So you might not know that, but there is an entire industry built around collecting your personal information and selling it to third parties. The companies that do that are called data brokers, and they try to collect information like your name, your phone number, your address, or your passport information, and whatever else you can imagine. And then they try to sell it to whoever is willing to pay for it. That's a big reason why mine and probably yours email inbox is constantly spammed by thousands of companies that are trying to sell you something, or worse, by scammers. And so to protect yourself, you might want to keep that data private, and that's where Delete Me comes in. Delete Me is a privacy data removal company that's been featured in New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal, and that's trying to give everyone control over their digital identity. If you sign up, they will remove your personal information that's being currently sold online from hundreds of data brokers, and they continue to repeat the removal as needed. And you get a regular personalized report of what exactly they removed. Right now, you can get 20% off by going to joindeleteme.com/Dom. So if you want to take control of your personal data, go ahead and check it out. Thanks Delete Me for sponsoring this. And now, back to the video. But first, let's explain how expensive New York is. Because while you might think it's bad, it's probably a lot worse than you think. And no other statistic shows it better than what most New Yorkers spend most of their money on: rent. In the past decade, rent in New York has increased by 68%, more than in any other major city in the US, and this pace has only been increasing over the past few years. In 2024, the median rent for a one-bedroom apartment in New York City is close to $3,500, or $41,000 per year. So if you wanted to stick to the rule of not paying more than 30% of your income on housing, you'd need to make at least $137,000 per year, but median household income in New York is about half of that. In other words, you need to make double the average salary to afford a very average one-bedroom apartment, and so already the math feels kinda off. Instead, the typical New York City household with an income of $70,000 spends more than half of that on rent, and half of the households in the city struggle to afford an apartment, food, and basic healthcare at the same time. And this disparity between what most people make and how much the city costs is only increasing, as in the past years, rents have grown by more than 10% every year, so twice as fast as salaries in New York. Average rent in Brooklyn, for example, went from $3,500 last year to almost $4,000 this year, and the whole thing is just becoming impossible to manage for more and more people. But the real question here is, why is that? Because while the most common explanation is that more people are always moving in, the city is not building enough housing, and so the prices always go up, that's just not true. Yes, New York doesn't build as much as it could. It builds less than other major cities, and it definitely should build more. But the simple explanation that New York City doesn't build enough for all the people coming in is just not very accurate. The fact is that New York's population hasn't actually changed all that much over the past decades, but the supply of housing has increased. Compared with 50 years ago, the city has just 400,000 more people, but 700,000 more housing units. and it has only 50,000 more people than in 2010, but over 300,000 housing units more, according to the city council data. And since 2020, the population of New York has actually significantly decreased by 6%, or 500,000 people, and it keeps going down every year since then. But rent has gone up, and it keeps going up at the same time. If it was just a simple issue of too many people for not enough space, this shouldn't have happened, and instead, rent should have decreased. After all, a number of experts forecasted that the rent will go down, but it never happened. And so in the case of New York, it's not about the city growing bigger, but rather about the fact that the city is changing, and quite radically. But to explain, we have to take a little history detour and disprove a common myth about New York City, that it has always been extremely expensive and unaffordable, because well, that's not actually true either. In the 1970s, New York was actually quite the opposite.
People once called New York Fun City. Now the police are calling it Fear City.
The city was hit really badly by an economic crisis. Unemployment was going up, and the city ran out of money to pay for almost anything. It was forced to cut a lot of services and fire a lot of public employees, and that resulted in even more unemployment and huge increase in crime and homelessness. As a consequence, it lost almost 1 million people in the 1970s.
If you had the wherewithal, you were getting the hell out of here as quick as you can.
And it was mostly the affluent, well-educated people with high-paying jobs who left. The people who did stay had to deal with a city that was notoriously dirty, infested with violent crime, and facing a lack of public services on a scale incomparable with today. Back then, New York was nicknamed Fear City, and the city cops were literally handing out flyers with guidelines for survival in the city, warning of high rates of violent crime. But for the people who endured that, the city actually got quite affordable, mostly since New York City wasn't seen as a very desirable or glamorous choice. That's why the movie trope of young people moving to New York, getting cheap apartments and jobs that don't pay much money but still getting by actually made a lot more sense back then than it does today, since the city was just a lot cheaper, everyone was a lot poorer, and there actually were affordable apartments. It wasn't until the 1990s when the economy started to improve, and it wasn't until 2000 when the population of New York got back to where it was 30 years before. And it was really only from then on that the city started to get increasingly more expensive and grew in population to all-time high levels. And here's the paradox that explains it all. Today, people are leaving once again, and if you watch the news about New York and the increase in crime and homelessness and all the other issues the city is dealing with, you might feel like it's the 1970s all over again. But the fact is that at least in some ways, it's actually the complete opposite. Because unlike back then, when it was the rich people leaving and poor people staying, today the poor and the middle class people are forced to leave, and only the rich people are able to stay. And that's not a feeling, but a statistic. The demographics of New York in the past years have been quickly changing, and the average New Yorker is quickly becoming increasingly older and wealthier. And when you look at which parts of New York City are the people leaving, you'll see that most people have left from the Bronx, the poorest borough, while Manhattan, the wealthiest, is the only one that increased in population. And while the poor and the middle class are leaving, there is more wealthy people in New York than ever before, and they keep coming in. Even throughout the pandemic, although 2,500 of millionaire households left the city, at the same time, it gained over 17,000 new ones. So overall, it gained over 15,000 new millionaires in just a few years. And at the same time, it lost 65,000 people making less than 65K a year. The lower middle class that's being priced out, and increasingly has no other option than to leave. And what's being built in New York is more and more reflecting this change and accelerating it at the same time, creating a spiral of rising costs that's gonna be very hard to ever break out of. Even in places where developers could build cheaper housing with more housing units, they increasingly tend to build fewer, larger, and more luxurious apartments. Because even though there is less people in New York, there is more people with money. And so there's demand for luxury housing, and it's more profitable for real estate developers to build this kind of real estate. Just look at the recent case of this building in Manhattan, where the developer was able to build as many as 77 apartments under the current regulation, but decided to build just 10 large luxurious apartments valued between 7 and 19 million, because there's just enough people who will buy those. And as a matter of fact, that's only gonna get a lot worse. Up until very recently, developers in New York were incentivized to build a certain percentage of affordable apartments in every new housing project, thanks to a special tax break known as 421A. This tax break has been in place since the 1970s, and it's considered one of the reasons why New York has at least some amount of affordable places for rent. But it actually expired in 2022, and even though it did have a net positive effect, it was not very popular, since it was a tax break for developers who are considered to be profiting off a housing crisis. And so it has not been renewed since, meaning that now there is no incentive for anyone to build anything remotely affordable anymore, and so the little number of not that expensive apartments that were being built is likely to go to zero. And so it doesn't matter even if the New York City population keeps shrinking. The city will keep getting more expensive anyway, because it will increasingly become a city basically only for the rich, or people with jobs that pay way above the average. And everyone else will either have to make increasingly absurd sacrifices to afford life in the city, commute into the city for many hours on a daily basis, or just move somewhere else. Now that will eventually spark a whole new set of problems, since a city needs more than just bankers to survive, and if none of the people who collect the garbage, teach your kids, and make you coffee can afford to live there, the system can't really function properly. And the changing demographics will increasingly change what the city and life in it is actually like. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's really up for everyone to decide on their own. And at the end of the day, living in a place like New York is a choice, and no one is forced to be there. But whether the choice will still be as appealing as it used to be, well, who knows?